Good morning. My name is Kyle Gatlin. I'm pastor at this church that you are worshiping with today, or if you're worshiping online, we thank you for being with us there. And I got an observation to make. My observation is we like to build walls. I think all of us do. I think all of us naturally have built walls, and I think particularly with the last couple years, we've built stronger walls. I think we built relationship walls because we are not wanting people, we don't want to get close to people. We don't want them to get close to us. And my challenge for you today is think about what will it take to bring those walls down? What will it take to bring those walls down? Many of us will most likely put our walls up with a whole lot of people. But there are times when we put walls up with those closest to us. I was talking to a person this morning, and this man has got walls up everywhere. He's not letting anybody in. When I was in college, one of the struggles that you have is meeting people for the first time. Because naturally, when you meet a stranger, there's walls, right? You're not sure if you want to let them in. They're not sure if they want to let you in. And so you have a natural wall. In college, I was part of Farmhouse Fraternity. We were on the quarter systems then, so we had really recruitment 3 times a year. 3 times a year. So we have parties and invite people as open thing. Just come to the house and start meeting all the fraternity brothers to decide if you want to be a part of us, and we decide if you will fit in with our group. We also had swaps with sororities regularly. Which one do you think was more fun? Just asking. Okay. All right. But we knew for the future of our fraternity, we had to put effort into recruiting dudes. You know, that was the lifeblood of our fraternity. We got to get more dudes in. And so it was always the same thing. If you came in and you didn't know anybody, you come up to one of us, what do we do? Hey, what's your name? Where are you from? What's your major? Right? That was sort of the standard opening 3 questions that you got. Well, over time, you get tired of doing that. You start, okay, I got to do something different. This is just not working for me because that's not doing anything. So we sort of made a game of it. And I should have asked some of my fraternity brothers what some of the questions they asked, but I do remember us talking about it a good bit. A handful of us would literally make it a game. So you'll never know the shock on a dude's face when you walk up to them and say, "What's your favorite color?" That works real well, doesn't it? Yeah. We did that. Hey, dude, what'd you have for lunch today? You know, just trying to break it up, trying to get those walls to come down. And when we meet people for the first time, normally what we do, we try to find something common to talk about. We find a common interest with that person to try to get those walls down. And of course, where we live in South Alabama, in the fall, we're going to try to break the walls down with football. That's what we're going to do. That's how we do it in the South and during football season. These walls that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about literal walls, but really what I want you to think about is the walls that we have in our life. Because I believe that the relationship walls are probably, I'm not going to say probably, I'm going to say they really are our biggest issue. For most of us, our relationship walls that we put up are our biggest issue. Because I want to remind you of something of who you are. You are created in the image of God. You know what that means? You're created in the image of one who is in relationship. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And the one who created us in his image, yes, he desires us to be in relationship with him, but he also has built us and made us in such a way that we're in relationship with each other. And when we put up a wall to keep others out, we're hurting ourselves. We're literally stunting our spiritual growth. Because there is just something about connecting with each other that builds us up. It really does. But I know there's other walls that we have too. We have political walls. We have racial walls. We have denominational walls. So we may have multiple walls. And in some of these we have built, well, we're actually continuing to build. I can see it now. We continue to build our political walls. We continue to build our racial walls. It's been a lifelong process for some of us. But I want us to understand today these walls need to come down. These walls need to come down. And we're going to be looking at Joshua 6 first, then we're going to look at Joshua 5. And what we're going to see in Joshua, the walls do come down. It's in Jericho. Some of you have heard the story before. But what does that represent? Jericho was in the promised land. Jericho was in the land that God said, okay, this land will provide you everything you need. This land is representing basically freedom and real life. Because what they had, Egypt for years and years and years in slavery, wandering around the wilderness, not knowing where to go, basically going in circles, and they really weren't living, they were existing, they were surviving for 40 years. And so this promised land that God had given them said, this is your land. And Jericho was that first place, that first city that they were to take. And that's really a symbol of new life and a symbol of freedom. And the walls came down, and that's what they got. So we're going to look at that story to see how God brought those walls down, and also consider how God can bring our walls down. And we're going to start with the end, and the end is the walls came down in Jericho, in Joshua chapter 6. I'm not going to reference any verses there right now. I just want to remind you of the story. So the Israelites had crossed the Jordan River. Remember, it was flooded. We've had that taught the last couple of weeks. The river was flooded. The flood water stopped. They crossed over into the promised land, and then they were getting ready to take Jericho. They'd already sent scouts into Jericho. They'd already seen, hey, the walls are formidable. Yeah, we got a couple people on the inside, but they're not going to help us too much. We just promised them that they're going to survive, Rahab and her family. So they come back with this report. The walls are formidable. And then God gives instructions to Joshua. All right, man, here's what you do, buddy. Gather everybody you can, all your army men, line them up and march around the city. Every day for 6 days, one time around the city. On the seventh day, you march 7 times around the city. On the 7th time, then the priests who are leading the group, they blow their trumpets, you give a great shout, and the walls will come down. Joshua and his people followed that to a T, and the walls came down, and they took the city. All right? I want you to think of a more current story about walls coming down. And this happened in West Berlin. 2 years before those walls came down, a speech was made by President Ronald Reagan on June 12, 1987. He said this: "There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace." And he called upon his Soviet counterpart, Secretary General Gorbachev, If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate. And then he said this.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This wall will fall, beliefs become reality.
So in 1989, November of 1989, the walls between East and West Berlin came down. Germany was united once again. They officially united actually in 1990, October 3rd of 1990. President Reagan's words did not tear down those walls. It wasn't his words that tore them down. It foreshadowed the fact that those walls came down. And when the Israelites who were marching around Jericho shouted, it really wasn't the shout that brought the walls down. God did that. God did that. And that's the point today. God is the one that can take down walls. God's the one that can take down walls. Now, when we look at our story in Joshua, I want to answer this question. What leads up to the walls coming down? What leads up to the walls coming down? We have the whole story in Joshua chapter 6 of all the marching, and then the walls calm down. Rahab is saved, and they've taken Jericho, and that's basically that all of chapter 6, right? But in chapter 5, I see three things that are foreshadowing before the walls came down. Three things that I believe would be helpful for us to consider for our walls to come down. The first one is actually this: know whose you are. For walls to come down, we need to know who we are. What does it take for the walls to come down? Knowing whose you are. I just want to remind you, you are not in this alone. In this life, you are not alone. You are not a lone ranger. Well, heck, even the Lone Ranger had Tonto, right? So he technically wasn't the Lone Ranger. He wasn't alone. We belong to God. We belong to God. That's whose we are. You know, the Israelites actually demonstrated this fact. They demonstrated in a real way that they belong to God. And it was a reminder that was very painful. Listen to this. Joshua 5. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." All the people that came out had been circumcised. Those who had come out of Egypt, right, had been circumcised. But all the people born in those last 40 years in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. Wow. 40-year-old men were getting ready to have this procedure done. All right? This is an outward sign. This is an outward sign of knowing whose you are. This was a sign that God didn't just arbitrarily decide, hey, you've been doing nothing for 40 years, we're going to make you do this. No, they had been doing it in Egypt, but in their haste, nothing happened then. All those who were of army fighting age had died since they left Egypt. So for 40 years, they've been birthing babies, and the boys had not had this procedure done. So you had up 40-year-old men all the way down to 20-year-old somethings, maybe even all the way down to teenagers who were fighting men. They were the ones getting it done. This was not just something started recently. Go back to Genesis chapter 17. God said to Abraham, "As for you, you must keep my covenant." God's talking to Abraham. We have a covenant. I'll be your God. You be my people. That's the covenant. You and your descendants after you for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you, the covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. If you were to undergo circumcision, it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. It was a sign. It was a sign. They belonged to God. Nobody else was doing this. Only the Israelites were doing this. It literally marked them as belonging to God. You know, I know there's some military folks, whether it be serving on the same ship, serving with the same company or division or battalion, or maybe like the Rangers or the SEALs. Some of them will get tattoos to identify, I'm a SEAL, I'm a Ranger, I'm on this ship, I'm in this division. That tattoo identifies who they belong to. A number of years ago, I met a guy that was actually looking to go into the ministry, and met with him a number of times, a formal thing that we were going through at the time, and he had tattoos. He had some pretty cool tattoos. And there was one tattoo that I said, you need to explain this one to me. And he said, this is my faith journey. This is the journey of where I was, the journey to where I am today in Jesus. And I went, that's pretty interesting. And he didn't say it in these words, but he did say that this actually opens the doors for me to talk about my faith in Jesus and my relationship with Jesus. He didn't say it this way, but he was saying it broke down a wall. It broke down a wall with some people just because of him having the tattoo on his arm. I wonder sometimes about you and me, about what sets us apart. What is something in our lives that we have, that we wear, that identifies us as set apart to God, that lets people know that I belong to God. It used to be the cross, right? You wear your cross, or you maybe have a cross tattoo, but that's, I hate to say it, but ever since Madonna came out, that just sort of out the door. But I'm not sure what it is. It's not like any of us can walk around and see what a person is wearing, either jewelry or clothes, and say that person belongs to God. We really don't have anything like that. Which puts a little more emphasis on what you say and how you treat people. That may be the telltale sign of who you belong to. Well, let me get back to this procedure. Most of us know, most of us who are parents and have had sons, we know that this procedure is normally done at 1 day old. And they seem to recover it pretty quickly. Unfortunately, they can't talk and tell us anything, so we just have to go by what they're telling us by crying. But you do the same procedure to a grown man, it's not as fun. In fact, there's a recovery time. And so when the whole 40-year-olds down to teenagers, fighting men, all had this procedure done, here's what Joshua 5:8 says. They remained where they were in camp until they were healed. Technically, they were vulnerable at this point. If somebody attacked them, they would be in no condition to defend the nation of Israel. Literally every fighting man was down. Okay? Multiple days. Just throwing that out there. But what is interesting is this word healed at the end of verse 8. And this was brought to my attention literally in 1992 in one of my last seminary classes. because the better translation is the American Standard Version, truthfully. And it came to pass when they had done circumcising all the nation that they abode in their places in the camp till they were whole. Until they were whole. That's the better translation. Because what this signifies, what reminds us here is this. Listen, we are broken people. We are living broken lives. And until we make a decision to set apart ourselves unto God, until we say, God, I am yours, until that happens, we can never truly be whole. Until we say, God, I belong to you. I am set apart to live for you. Until we do that, we will never be whole. You know, so Paul actually understood that what circumcision was not all about a ceremonial thing. Here's what he said in Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. I'm reading this for you. It's not going to be on your screen. A person is not a Jew who is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God. He says a person, he's basically saying, listen, what is a Jew? A Jew is a person set apart to God. They said, I'm with you, God. I'm set apart. And he's saying the person is not simply that just by some medical procedure. He's saying, listen, it's a circumcision of the heart. A person who calls upon God and says, God, I am yours, that's a circumcision of the heart. That's and in his words, that's who the Jew is supposed to be. It's pretty interesting that when you start throwing all these words together, healed and whole and stuff, that when you do call on God and say, I am yours, you will be healed of your brokenness and you will be made whole. But there's one other word there. In the Hebrew, the word that we just were translated, healed and whole, is the word chahala. Yeah, I know it sounds Klingon, doesn't it? But anyway, chahala. You know what it means? Live. It means to live. And so let me tell you, friends, let me tell you this. Only when you say to God, I am yours, only then will you truly live. Only then will you truly live. What does it take for the walls to come down? It takes recognizing whose we are, that we belong to God. It also takes recognizing what God has done. We need to know what God has done. And for these Israelites, what happened to them? As soon as they were made whole, as soon as they were healed, they celebrated the Lord's Supper. No, they didn't. They celebrated Passover. Okay? They celebrated Passover. They celebrated Passover. On the evening of the 14th day of the month, while camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, the Israelites celebrated Passover. The day after the Passover, that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened bread and roasted grain. The manna stopped the day after they ate this food from the land. There was no longer any manna for the Israelites. But that year, they ate the produce of Canaan. What is Passover? Let me do you a quick reminder. Passover, the angel of death passed over the Israelites when they made a sacrifice on their doors of blood They put it on their blood when they were in Egypt. All the firstborn in Egypt were killed. The last plague in Egypt. But the Israelite family knew to put blood over their doorposts so the angel of death passed over them. And then ever since that happened, even in the wilderness, they remembered and they celebrated what God had done to bring them out of Egypt, to bring them out of slavery. And so they celebrated. They celebrated what God has done. And in this case, I want you to catch this. The manna stopped once they did this. Because what were they doing? They were celebrating what God had done, but they were acknowledging, hey, because what God had done for us, He brought us out of Egypt, then He was with us for all these years in the wilderness. What He had done to bring us to this point, they're recognizing what God had done because that indicated what God would do. You remember the quote in some form of the fashion, past performance indicates future fortune. You heard some quote like that? And that's what's going on. When they were celebrating their Passover, they were understanding that God's past performance was awesome. He got us out of Egypt. He helped us survive in the wilderness. We were wandering around in circles, but He gave us manna. He gave us water. And they were recognizing and knowing, we know what God has done. And that indicates what God will do, that God will continue to do in our lives. God, you've proven yourself trustworthy, and I'm going to trust you going forward. For our walls to come down, we need to count on God and trust God as well. Because past performance indicates future fortune. And God has been with His people, supplied His people, given them, provided everything. And so when we get to a point where our walls need to come down, guess what? God's going to show up. God's going to show up. We talk about relationships, and we're trying to get those walls down. What we're really talking about is vulnerability. We're talking about being able to let the walls come down so that we can share life with another person. And we're not good at that. We've gotten worse at that. Because we'd rather text you or send you a tweet rather than sit in the same room with you or go to dinner with you. If we can catch this, folks, if we can catch this idea, we let our walls come down in relationships with each other, something wonderful happens. Something wonderful happens when we are vulnerable with another person, particularly as it pertains to our walk with God, to our relationship with Jesus. Something wonderful happens. There's a reason that Proverbs tells us that iron sharpens iron. If we are people who are desiring not to just be around God, but people who are literally wanting to honor God with our lives, who are wanting to lift up the name of God, to worship Jesus Christ and Him alone, and we're wanting to become closer and closer to become more like Jesus, then we need each other for that. And I don't care, you could read the Bible 10 hours a day, but if you're by yourself, guess what? You're not going to be living into that life that God has called you to live in. You will not experience that freedom that he has given his people if you're not doing that with each other. What's the reason to have churches if that's the case? And of course we know the reason we have churches is to pay the preachers. That's why we have churches, right? The reason we provide gathering places is because there's something cool about it, but there's something more than cool. It's something about growing together in Jesus. And when we know what God has done, guess what? He's going to be there with us. His past performance has indicated he's going to be with us as we do this, as we become closer to him and become closer to each other. And let me just say this. It is a big deal about relationship walls, but I want to tell you what I've observed in our world is we put up so many political walls. We're putting up so many racial walls. We're putting up denominational walls. And folks, if we can get a handle on this thought, okay? If we get a handle on this, that God is in that. We got to tread lightly, all right? Politically, we are really divided. But can we understand that God is there? God is with also the person on the opposite side of the political fence as us. Do we understand God is there with them? Can we understand that God is with those with that racial divide? God is there in that. God is there in the denominational divide. God is there. And when God is there, guess what? When we recognize that, we recognize that walls will come down. Walls will come down. One other thing that leads up to the walls coming down, which sort of dovetails what I just said, knowing that God invites us to come alongside. God invites us to come alongside. Many of us have actually said this, and I think Hayes usually said this about once a year, that we decide what we want to do, we make plans, we budget it out, we have it on paper, we're ready to go. And before we make that first step, we go, God, would you bless this before I step out to do this? We've all done it. We all want what we want, and we have a plan, and we've got it financed, we've got the documents all ready to go, and we're 1 hour away from starting it, and we want God's stamp of approval on it. We've all done that. Joshua had no idea how he was going to defeat Jericho. You know that? Joshua didn't have a plan. He didn't pull his generals together and say, okay, who's going to take the west side, who's going to take the north side, who's going to throw the hooks over the... No, none of that. He had no plan at all. Watch what happens. Joshua chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. When Joshua was near Jericho, they're getting close, he looked up, saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied. He might have said neither, but I'm not sure, okay? But as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. What message do you have? This is a holy place. That was the message. Really, that was the message. I love what this the person, which is an angel, a lord, whatever it is, whoever it is. Commander of the Lord's army is all we know right now. When asked, who are you for? Are you for us? You against us? Or are you for us, right? You against us? You for us? Neither. Huh? That doesn't make sense. Well, it does. Because God doesn't take sides. Although all of us on the political divide and the racial divide and the denominational divide thinks he does. But he doesn't take sides. And when Joshua recognizes what he was doing, and he was standing in the midst of holiness right there, that signified to the commander of the Lord's army, you know what? Joshua is choosing to be on the Lord's side. Joshua still had to choose to be on the Lord's side. And when he makes that choice, verse 2 of chapter 6, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. And then he proceeds to tell him how to do it. Joshua had to first understand and say, I'm on your side. He had to make that commitment first before God then started telling him the outline of how to beat Jericho. When God is lifted up, walls come down. When God is lifted up, walls come down. Joshua was standing on holy ground. He was lifting up the name of God, and then a few days later, the walls come down. Abraham Lincoln had a wonderful quote that happened during the Civil War time when somebody was asking him about, do you believe God is on our side? And he said this, my concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side. For God is always right. So I want you to remember this. God comes alongside. He doesn't choose sides. Did you catch that? God comes alongside. He doesn't choose sides, but we do. We do. For our walls to fall, we first of all need to know whose we are. And we need to know what God has done, because what he has done will be a predictor of future fortune that he's going to provide for us. And then we need to choose to come alongside of him. Because here's the deal. We see it all throughout the Bible. When God is in on something, when God's there in the midst, walls come down. When God is lifted up, walls come down. When you choose to be one of God's kids, when you choose to be set apart to God, then he is lifted up and walls come down. When you remember what God has done, knowing that he will continue to do so, then God is lifted up and walls come down. And when you choose to recognize the place that you're in is holy, and when you choose to understand that you are in the presence of the Lord and you've chosen to come alongside him, walls come down when he is lifted up. Yeah, last thing that Reagan said, he said, this wall will fall. Beliefs will become reality. What you choose to believe today will become reality tomorrow. And if you choose wisely, if you choose to become set apart by God, if you choose to understand and remember what He's done and will continue to do for you, and if you choose to be on His side, walls will come down. When God is lifted up, walls come down. God, that is so easy to say, but so hard for us to really comprehend and actually put into practice. To understand in our lives where we have built so much into these walls, where we're not allowing people in, where we're not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. But God, you have said, listen, if you want real freedom, if you truly want to live, those walls need to come down. And when you're with me, and when you're remembering what I've done and continue to do for you, and when you choose me, those walls will fall. So God, may we go from this place today, understanding whose we are, what you're going to do in our lives, and choose you so that those walls will come down. When you are lifted up, walls come down. Make it so. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.